Green now. All right. Welcome to Ensure Justice to Build a Resilient Child 2022. This is a virtual conference. We're being very careful to follow all of the COVID protection protocols. And I am Dr. Sandra Morgan, the director of Vanguard University's Global Center for Women and Justice. And it is my honor to partner with our friends and colleagues here in the Navajo Nation to offer this virtual conference on human trafficking and child resilience, which is a key piece of prevention. We are so grateful to our partners, Pastor Jackie and Lenora Holgate, for our students from Vanguard University that have been here on a learning experience as part of their academic career. And we are especially thankful for the First Lady and Second Lady's support out of the Navajo Nation in the Capitol at Window Rock. And I just want to start by summarizing this year's conference theme, to build a resilient child. This will focus on building wellness, support, and resilience for our Navajo children and communities as we continue to navigate the changes in anti-trafficking efforts post-pandemic. This is a great goal. And it's a little awkward for many of us to be speaking to a camera, but we are very excited that you are with us. And the most encouraging thing for me is I'm already getting texts and messages on Sketch, the app where you're joining us from. So please share that with your friends. Anybody can join. I want you to know that the Sketch app and the sessions will all be recorded and you'll be able to access those from the app later and share with your friends. I don't need to tell you where the restrooms are like we usually do at a conference because you know where yours are, right? Of course. So we are delighted today to start our conference with an opening panel on what is human trafficking. And we will have the Navajo Nation First Lady, Phefelia, and Deputy Chief Derek Marsh, who is the Associate Director of the Global Center for Women and Justice, and myself on this opening panel. So let me do some bios. Phefelia was born in Keene Canyon, Arizona, and raised on Hopi partition land in Big Mountain, Arizona. She's married to Jonathan Nez and the mother of two children, Christopher and Alexander Nez. She is the daughter of David and Julia Herbert. Growing up in a traditional Hogan, she had ample outdoor space. She enjoyed a childhood of running, hiking, and biking. Phefelia earned her Bachelor of Science degrees in political science with an emphasis in comparative and international politics and criminal justice from Northern Arizona University. She recently earned a Master's of Public Administration and is also an alumna of the ASU Lodestar Center's Generation Next Nonprofit Leadership Academy Class 5. Congratulations on your latest graduation, First Lady. Our second member of this panel is Associate Director Derek Marsh, who works at the Global Center for Women and Justice. He is researching how human trafficking task forces identify, investigate, and prosecute labor trafficking cases throughout the United States through on-site visits and review of historical task force and federal performance documents. He is helping to develop and provide training and technical assistance through the BIA, TTAC, and OVC TTAC agencies. You're going to have to ask him about those alphabets. His expertise in criminal justice contributes to the research, education, and advocacy mission of the Global Center for Women and Justice. So I'd like to invite our keynote panelists to join me on the stage. And the microphones for this panel will be, oh, here they are. So we'll start that. This is very exciting. This is our first time, and my team is delighted to be here. But even more so, we are very grateful to First Lady Phefelia Nez. And I'm going to hand this over now to our facilitator, Matthew Holgate, our Vanguard alum now. He just graduated, but he's taking this course, this study abroad course for credit. So I'm going to be taking points on or off, Matthew.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Whether it's in person or online, yat esh kedosh den Matthew Holgate inishia. This is Lana Nishna do Torchini Bushes China Kaidene Dashache dog. This is Lana Dashanella. Ado Natsasan de Nasha Shamato Shaja Lenore do Jackie Holgate Willia. Shamasana do Shache Elsie do Russell Shorty Willia. Shanella San A Jean Marie Holgate Willia. Chanella Hustine A Lee Barlow William. Well, I'm so excited to be here for this first ever Ensure Justice. We are just so grateful to have our guests here today and throughout the rest of the week, and it's going to be an amazing time. So to get this session started off with our opening keynote panel entitled "What is Human Trafficking?" Like Dr. Morgan introduced everybody, we have Derek Marsh here with us today. We have First Lady Phefelia Nez and Dr. Sandra Morgan. So to begin this session, talking about human trafficking and educating us in the field, we want to come from different perspectives. The audience that is listening with us today, we want to talk about the basics of what is human trafficking, what does it look like from a tribal view, and what does it look like from a law enforcement view. So if you want to start with Dr. Sandra Morgan on your presentation. Okay, just kidding. We are going to start with the Navajo Nation First Lady Phefelia Nez to give her presentation in this plenary.
Oh yeah, te are da is not agi she ya karosha dodge Phefelia Nez again she tabaha initially is a na bashes chain na kaidina da shinal da she ado the sare you see she ho up. And so now we're talking about, human trafficking on the Navajo Nation. You can always put it in the perspective of the home and the family, the environments of those across Navajo land. And when you look at the landscape based on what a lot of our home environments look like and the types of environments that our children are growing up in and exposed to, and you see the data that comes from law enforcement, from criminal investigations, and then of course everything else that all the information that is over at social services and even at prosecutor's office. You look at all of that and you see that we don't have a lot of healthy homes and healthy environments that our children are growing up in. And in terms of any type of crimes, and here we're talking about human trafficking. I mean, if you're coming from a criminal, if you're coming from a predatory mindset, it really leaves an almost open landscape for a lot of things to occur. And human trafficking is definitely one of those. And so we're just kind of here to address what it is and what it looks like, because a lot of times I think a lot of our people don't understand exactly what human trafficking really, what it is. And I'm sure it will be, through tonight and then into tomorrow, that a lot of the information that will be presented is going to focus on that, what it is, what it looks like. And really, so, we want our parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles, anybody who's guardians of children, and even for adults themselves to understand and start looking at and becoming aware of what some of these things is, what the things are that they should be looking for, and then what to do if they do see some of these things. And so I just want to open with that. Thank you.
Thank you, First Lady Phefelia Nez. And now we are going to move on to our Associate Director for the Global Center for Women and Justice, Derek Marsh.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, First Lady. My perspective today is really going to be focused more on discussing the laws pertaining to human trafficking from a more of a federal perspective. We have another expert coming tomorrow. We'll focus more on how those laws impact the Navajo Nation. So first thing to understand is that human trafficking has been around forever. We've had it basically in many ways called modern day slavery, but before it was modern day slavery, it was just slavery. And it's been around for millennium. It's been done, to different civilizations across the board. I don't think there's a civilization around that didn't have some type of slavery as a result of their, society and how they were interacting with other groups. We don't care about that necessarily today because it means more we understand what happens now. So back in 2000, the federal government put together the Trafficking Victim Protections Act. It was the first time that human trafficking was addressed as a specific criminal act. So what does that mean? That means that since the year 2000, we're in 2022, we've had 22 years of federal laws that allow us to look at particular acts as being potentially criminal and potentially related to human trafficking. Initially, the human trafficking group of laws, legislation, support for victims was something it was very simple, it was very basic. It was the very first introductory law. But every 3 to 4 years, lawmakers at the federal level have been asked to reassess based on the experiences of law enforcement in the field, social workers in the field, faith-based organizations in the field, to see how they can improve the law, both in regards to criminal consequences, both in regards to victim-centeredness and making sure that we're treating people in a trauma-informed, culturally sensitive way, and also to make sure that the legislation is open enough that we can continue to modify it over time as new situations and new ways of investigating and helping people arise. So we are now, I think, in the fifth or sixth iteration of our federal laws. And basically what we're talking about when we talk about human trafficking isn't taken. So if those who saw the movie, I love Liam Neeson, please forgive me, Liam. It is, and I was human trafficking, I'll give you that, but it's never quite that exciting. Basically what human trafficking is compelling someone to do something against their will for commercial gain with regards to sexual acts or just general labor. I'm gonna say that one more time. Human trafficking is basically compelling someone against their will to perform certain acts commercially, to commercially benefit the person making them do it with regards to sexual activities or acts of labor. So what does that mean in reality? So let's put Taken aside and all the exciting Liam Neeson scenes. What does that mean in a day-to-day enforcement level, and how does that impact the Navajo Nation? Basically, you're looking at anytime someone tries to recruit somebody, tries to induce or harbor someone or hold them, tries to transport or provide somebody for the purposes of commercial sex or commercial labor, and they use force, fraud, or coercion, then they are human traffickers. Now, there are particular laws that deal with adult sex trafficking versus minor sex trafficking, and there are a whole different set of laws dealing with just labor trafficking. However, all these laws work together to try to get people out of the situations they are and help treat them in a victim-centered, trauma-informed way. before I go on, I want to give Matt a chance to talk to other people, maybe get Dr. Morgan's perspective on what we're talking about here too.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for sharing, Derek. Like you said, I like to talk to you a little bit more on giving us more of the more, for lack of better terms, the basic terminology of what defines human trafficking and what creates the term of human trafficking, and really just explain the umbrella to us.
I like the term umbrella because some people. I will use a microphone. Hi, everybody out there. Thank you for tuning in. I love the term umbrella because a lot of the issues of today that are social injustice issues fall into a category that might include human trafficking. And when I talk to people, when I first started in this a long time ago, they were confused by the use of the word traffic. They got it confused with cars and things. But we use the term trafficking whenever something that's not supposed to be sold is illicitly sold for profit. And that happens in the trafficking of weapons, the trafficking of drugs, and the trafficking of people. We are not supposed to sell any of those things. And the elements of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Palermo Protocol that Derek spoke about, three things of force, fraud, and coercion become ways of identifying the how, the means that distinguishes human trafficking from other crimes. And the idea of force, someone is literally grabbed or kidnapped, which I have to tell you is pretty rare because it's much easier to use fraud. And when people, as First Lady talked about, are in really unstable home situations and someone offers them a job that sounds amazing, they may say, I can get away from this, and then find out that what was promised wasn't actually what they experienced. So that's fraud. And coercion is more than just a threat. It is a manipulation. And once that person arrives at their destination, at this fabulous job they were supposed to be going to, no violence to get them there, just a dream dangled in front of them. Now, if they leave that situation, they may face consequences of violence or threats against a family member. They may be told that they will be turned into authorities because they don't have their documents. The trafficker took their documents. And this method of exploiting people is part of the hallmark of human trafficking that's global. And when I talk about the term exploitation, that's a really important term in lots of the human trafficking stories that you will hear, and some you'll hear this weekend. Someone is exploiting a vulnerability of another person. Exploitation is a business term. And when you think about how someone is exploiting a market, exploiting a person, they're taking advantage of them to make money. It's about profit.
Yes, thank you for going a little deeper into that, the terminology of what human trafficking is. I really, for me to understand as a student, trying to understand, taking the classes and learning really about this issue, not just in the United States, but globally. I know we've been able to travel to different places like Argentina and really some different places around Orange County. And First Lady Nez, I don't know if you want to tag team with Dr. Morgan, but just talk to us a little bit about some of the things on the Navajo Nation, some things about our people that would distinguish us from, let's say, another victim from South America, because traffickers use documentation as a means to say, if you must come to work for me, I will have your documentation and I won't give it to you until you pay your debt. So things like that, I know cross-culturally we don't see. But what makes the Navajo Nation individual and unique, just from your perspective, what makes the Navajo Nation unique when we talk about human trafficking?
So for Navajos, and probably for any other tribal groups, anytime they get involved in any type of criminal situation or scenario, and when it comes to the criminal justice system, just being Native American, I think just right off the bat, I mean, if we could easily be, identified as in Japanese or, Asian American or any other, there's a lot of other groups that we could easily pass as. And so misidentification would be one thing. And then just being on tribal lands, if something like this occurs there's a lot of, interjurisdictional issues that come about. And so when it comes to us as tribal nations, this is where we really have to get in the business of coordinating services, coordinating efforts, and then really to open up those communication and coordination of services is a big thing when it comes to a case like this, because as you talk about even just probably just any type of trafficking, and I know there were some that were mentioned by law enforcement yesterday, right? I mean, the case of labor trafficking that was mentioned, and then I think Director Henderson tomorrow will probably mention the case where, human trafficking has occurred for tribal peoples. And so it's not something that we can't say doesn't happen. We know of, the one case, but, it just makes you wonder how many other cases have occurred that have just not been reported or not in the criminal justice data yet. And so really it's it for Navajo Nation, I really think we're barely at the education stage where we're bringing through this and through hopefully future efforts, really to bring this topic and to bring even the definition of it to the Navajo people, because I'm pretty certain they see certain things occurring, but they just don't put the two together. And so really, this is I guess we're at the very beginning stages of actually bringing this information to the people. If we were somewhere further along in, let's say 5-10 years in, right, of people knowing what this is and what to look out for, I think we would have a different story and maybe a whole different data set on what actually occurs and, the outcome of a lot of these cases.
Thank you, First Lady. In talking about human trafficking and in talking about, a lot of the different areas that First Lady just touched on, I'm going to ask Derek Marsh if you would mind sharing with us a little bit more on the law enforcement side, the uniqueness of the Navajo Nation. Tell us about like the AMP model. Tell us about some of, the basic terms as well that we should be aware of that, creates a victim of human trafficking, because many of us watching probably don't know. We don't know, the 4 to 5 Ps that we have in the global centers. Would you mind just sharing a little bit more on the law enforcement perspective on this?
Certainly, Matt, thank you. Well, I think the first thing to think about is when I started working with human trafficking back in 2004, which is a few years after the TVPA, the impression of human trafficking was that it was only for nationals who could be human trafficked. that our own people within the United States, our, our indigenous folks, our domestic, everyone else was not really, there's no such thing as trafficking in that world. And so when we started focusing on human trafficking back then, we were focusing on foreign nationals. People have been brought into the country to be exploited, commercially so, in either labor or sex. As the understanding of human trafficking matured over time, we begin to realize that domestic people and victims and anybody from any tribe, Navajo Nation, wherever, they could also be considered human trafficking victims if they met the criteria of the laws. And this was something that I think was probably, it took about 10 years for it to kind of percolate and for people to process. The other thing that was unique was that in this particular crime, whereas I was used to it and I was trained, you go get the bad person, you put them in jail, you file your report, and you're the hero, whatever. In human trafficking, it's a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach. So we allow the victim much more agency than we normally do in any kind of criminal justice type of situation. And this was a hard way to change our gears, because the people who we had thought of historically as being potentially suspects in a crime were actually the victims of a crime. And it's something that we all need to embrace. For instance, people who've been prostituted. When I first came on, if someone was walking on the street, or we found somebody who was, selling themselves in a motel or a hotel situation, they were a suspect. They were the bad person. They were the person we're going to take to jail. Now, things have changed. We understand that people are prostituted. They are not prostitutes. We understand that they are victims of something that's been forced upon them against their will. And as a result, the mentality and the shift we have has to be taken into account. So what does that all mean? So you can look at somebody who you think might be voluntarily prostituting themselves. And there are those people out there who do. But many times there's somebody behind the scenes who might be commercially, I mean financially, benefiting. It can be trade or barter too. We've had cases where parents would sell their children for drugs or for other types of property or things like that because they couldn't afford to pay for those things without doing so. We've had situations where family members would exploit their own cousins, their own brothers, sisters, parents, again, children, things that you would just hope would be horrible, something you would hope would be so egregious, like, holy cow, please, this can't be happening. And yet that's what they're doing. So the bottom line is we don't often see the physically traumatic people in handcuffs, locked in a room, being forcibly, exploited situations that you see, like again in Taken or other more commercialized, media that we see out there. Instead, what we find is people who have vulnerabilities, people who are trying to get out of those vulnerabilities and trying to make better for themselves, being misled by people who are basically predatory, who are trying to commercially exploit them with the idea that, hey, if you just work with me, you'll eventually get something out of this too. So the idea that you can have a girl who's run away, maybe to meet and meet somebody, or run away to be with someone who they think is going to be their romantic partner, who then turns the tables on them. And while they both, he claims that he loves her and she believes in this love, and she hasn't maybe perhaps gotten the love that she was expecting from home or wanted. And so this is a brand new experience and she's excited. Someone thinks she's beautiful and it wants to be with her. And all of a sudden he turns around and says, hey, we need money. I can't get a job right now. But if we could sell your body to make money, that would make us both happy. If you love me, you would do that for me. And well, as adults, we may look at this and go, who would think that would be a viable, way of approaching someone when you're young and your brain hasn't developed? And we'll talk about that in another session in the future. And you maybe have experienced some abuse, some neglect, some emotional trauma in your past from family members or other people. That may seem like the best solution that you can make out of your life at that time. So when we've had the pleasure and, really an open-minded experience of traveling through parts of the Navajo Nation for the past several days. And I can tell you, beautiful country, so spread out. I don't think there's anything closer than 45 minutes away, no matter where you go. And half of it's on dirt roads, and that's great. I mean, it is what it is. But unfortunately, what that leads to is a lot of loss of community in a way. If you look at the the level to which you maybe even worry about getting electrical in your home, or plumbing, or those types of things. Those are things a lot of people recognize and they deal with as they grow up, maybe, but they don't want to be that way the rest of their lives. And if they don't have a proper education, if they don't have access to other resources that might help them move forward to special job skills or to special job training, then they try to put it on themselves to try to get better. And as a result, they make themselves vulnerable people who might be in the family, friends and neighbors, whatever, who could potentially exploit them. And they don't know any better till they're in the middle of those situations. So from a law enforcement perspective, understanding how these people can be psychologically almost like indoctrinated, if you will, but convinced that this is a good situation for them, even though it's not, is something that we really have to be aware of, and families need to be understanding about. Because a lot of times we've had families say, well, I can't believe my daughter or my son would get themselves in a situation. And the reality is, hey, we're all human. We all make mistakes. And especially when you're young and your hormones are running high and you're trying to be adamant and trying to be passionate, and maybe you've had some abuse and other things in your past, making great decisions isn't always what's going to happen. And as law enforcement, we try to appreciate that. And we try to make sure that we take care of our victims. We call them victim survivors. We want them to survive and be resilient and be successful in the end. We take care of them by making sure they can help us come to understanding what the situation is, how we can fix it for them in their eyes, for their perception, not for what I think is right, what they think would be best for them, but also be able to understand who took advantage and exploited them, and how we can intervene and hold them accountable for those types of heinous actions.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you for giving us some examples and clear definitions of just your perspective from the law enforcement side. Something that really stood out to me that you mentioned was, the lack of resources and how that plays a big role. As you may or may not know, watching, some statistics on our Navajo Nation are, there is limited access for some households to running water. Like my grandma doesn't have running water, and it wasn't until recently she had electricity. So these resources, there's a difference between, the Navajo Nation and urban communities like Flagstaff, Farmington, Gallup, and we see a lot of differences. Though we may see the same faces in the same family, there are many differences between the tribal communities, especially in the rural areas, and with just here out in the urban cities. So Dr. Morgan, how does natural resources play into the umbrella of human trafficking?
Lots of research has been done on how people are victimized as vulnerable because of their circumstances. But I have a slightly different response to that. I believe that I think we may have already mentioned when the Trafficking Victims Protection Act and the Palermo Protocol, the UN version, were passed, there were 3 Ps: prevention, protection, and prosecution. I'm leaving prosecution to the law enforcement people and protection to the social services people. But I believe the most neglected P is the prevention P. How do we take into consideration resource scarcity and vulnerabilities so that we reduce the exploitability of the people? How do we understand? And part of our student team that we traveled and we asked questions at chapter houses, we visited homes without running water. How do we begin to make prevention changes that reduce vulnerability? And I think that's one of the big opportunities that is often being missed in the anti-human trafficking community.
Yes, and if you are new to the insured justice community, or if you are new to this topic on human trafficking, Dr. Morgan, would you mind explaining a little bit more on which P we're trying to hit on this throughout this week?
Well, ultimately, we started with 3 back in 2000: prevention, protection, and prosecution. And I was actually living in Greece, and I saw lots of examples of what human trafficking looked like outside of the United States. And then when I returned to the US, that's when I met Derek Marsh, and he was putting together a human trafficking task force. And when you think about a task force, a task force is a group of people who come together to bring various aspects of expertise to the table: law enforcement, victim services, educators. And as we grew in our understanding of who we needed to have at the table, we added a fourth P: partnership. And partnership is defined as the application of expertise and resources that you bring to the task force. And it's not about you've got extra shampoo, but it's about what is needed by the task force to accomplish their ultimate goal of preventing, identifying victims, protecting them, and prosecuting the perpetrators. So we had 4 Ps. Then a few years ago in the international community, they added a 5th P: policy. I am over the top excited about learning more and more about policy. We've just been adopting it for the last few years, but policy creates opportunities to be more systematic in our communities and improve our ability to prevent as well as identify victims. And you're going to hear more about those 5 Ps during this conference. But again, I come back to prevention. Why would you wait at the bottom of a cliff? And when I was up in the canyons with Matthew this week, I stayed far back from the edge. But we sometimes have this sense that we're waiting at the bottom for someone to fall. And we've got an ambulance and we're going to take them off and rescue them and save them. What if we build a fence at the top so they don't fall? That's prevention. Let's do something so that they don't become victims. And we're going to talk about that a lot in the next 2 days.
Wow, Dr. Morgan, that's powerful. Just the visual you gave us of building the fence before the cliff and the canyon, and what can we do to build that fence? First Lady, I'd like to ask you kind of along that line, as you know, a leader in our community on the Navajo Nation, what are some efforts, what are some things that you've done to try to strive for this theme of to building a resilient child with building that fence? But what are some practical ways that our people from our community can start to get involved with that mindset as well?
So from the Office of First Lady and Second Lady, our focus has always been on the home and the family, and just working on, with the New Mexico MMIW task force, which is a related topic: missing and murdered and human trafficking. You're talking about both, missing persons, but here we're talking about trafficking, which is a little bit more specific. And working with them, and then of course working on the tribal community response plan for missing and unidentified persons. Looking at the entire criminal justice system of the Navajo Nation. And then I delve a lot into early childhood education, early childhood development, and then early childhood mental health. And I do those things because I truly believe that the home environment, that was the first institution that was given to us. And as a mom and a dad, and I always say that those are the 2 most important roles that we're ever going to play in life, and it's something to be taken seriously. That, along with the importance of marriage. And so I always go back to that. But when you look at it from a criminal justice lens, it's so important to look at that too as well, because anytime anybody ever gets involved in the criminal justice system, they always go back to looking at their childhood. What kind of home environment did they grow up in? What kind of traumatic experiences were they exposed to? All of that, when you grow up as a child being neglected of certain things that should be provided for you within a home environment, I mean, that really sets you on a trajectory of negative outcomes. So when we talk about prevention, education, and even from a public health lens, we want to stay in that arena because, just like Dr. Morgan said, we want to be we don't want to wait until the other analogy I always use is we don't want to continue fishing people out of the river. What about making sure that they never fallen in the first place? And so this is kind of along those efforts. So for me, it's always about the home environment, and if we can really strengthen our our marriages, and then our parenting skills, and then really getting a good understanding of what a child really needs from conception on into maybe their entire childhood. But we know that that doesn't necessarily happen on the Navajo Nation currently. So those early intervention, those just access to resources for families while the kids are still young, or maybe before they're even conceived, to impart some of this knowledge and information to the parents. And I think that really would make an impact for our homes.
Yes. I think something that really stood out from what you just shared with us is really just the power to empower our children to move forward, but still remembering our past. And I think one topic that I feel like I felt personally throughout my this week, being on the Navajo Nation in different places, I really felt like we still, we live in our trauma. And I feel like it's been hard for us to address that. And it's been hard for us to, live life, because some of us are still stuck in those places. And, with respect, because it was, if in the history, it was awful. There are a lot of things, for how we experience trauma is different in so many different ways. And Dr. Morgan.
I was personally very impacted by visiting a boarding school that one of my friends as a child was taken to. And I know some of the people that are participating in this virtual conference didn't get to come with us and see things in person. And just in a really brief capsule, imagine a first grader being brought to a boarding school where the very first thing that happens is having his head shaved and losing his hair and being forced to speak only English. And I think one of the things that impacted me the most is that to teach them English. And I've lived in a lot of countries, and one of the ways I learn languages is watching movies. So that sounds like a good idea. Somebody probably had some good intentions, but the movies that they watched were old Western movies. And the Indians are not the heroes in those movies. Imagine being 6 years old and watching movies like that. How does that impact your personal development, your confidence? There are so many areas of building resilience in this generation, but also restoring resilience in people who still remember those experiences. We walked on those grounds. Those buildings still exist. There are broken windows, but they still exist, and they're a reminder of a past. And we want to look at how do we overcome that past and restore resilience.
And I think it'd be appropriate to ask First Lady, that question. What are some ways, for us to build a future and a legacy for our children? How can we walk, not just see them grow and succeed, but how can we walk with them?
I always enjoy sharing this particular message with people, because when working with Casey family programs and their suicide prevention efforts, they always say there's 4 things a child needs, and it's identity, connection, purpose, but the first one is safety. And I always try to impart that to families and to communities. And I think if we were to bring in, to build up the capacity to bring in, to build up these resources and services to people and really to educate them on not just what to do when something happens, but to really get them into the mindset of building strong, strong family environments that really gets them, just as I mentioned before, putting people on a trajectory of positive outcomes in life. And that really does involve early intervention, a lot of services at the front end, but also to really set them on a trajectory where it will, the outcomes include that they'll have education, that they'll have employment, that they'll have access to housing. And I mean, if you can just have those three items in your life, that really puts you at, it's it's going to reduce your chances of really being the victim of something horrible happening. And if we can do that for all our children, that to me is the most, I mean, it's not something that's going to happen immediately. I've heard some people say, even if we all chose right now to really bring in those kind of environments for our children and to educate ourselves on how to be better parents and better mentors, and just get into the business of really, in the role of parenting all children, right? It's going to still take, I used to say 2 generations, but I've heard 3 generations. So it's a long term, it takes that long to see the full results of all of this. But I think it really does fall back on all of us to get into those mindsets and to really start educating ourselves individually and to start changing the way we think, the way we feel. It really starts with the evaluation part, though, because as you mentioned, at some point in your life, you really have to stop and assess your own childhood and your own upbringing, and then realize that your parents didn't know a lot of things, but we have to be forgiving enough to accept that, they did their best with what they knew and what they had. But for us, we have a lot more access to a lot more opportunities we have access to a lot more, we have the ability to gain that knowledge and to make those changes in our lives to really make an impact of change for our future generations.
Wow, thank you, First Lady, for sharing that and just your heart behind that. It really stands out, and it really, it gives me hope as a youth, and just what I should be looking forward to in the futures to come, and how I can partner with our students in the future. And as we're wrapping up this session, I want to ask Derek to give us some closing remarks from you and from Dr. Morgan. But I'll start with Derek, and I just want to ask you to, with First Lady talking about safety, how does that play into the prevention part of human trafficking? As you know, safety is really big in the prosecution side, and it's making sure kids are safe and these things. But what are some ways, as you've experienced the Navajo Nation and the vastness, really, we heard from Sergeant Billy, and just a lot of different things, differences that they have from Orange County, California. Give us some perspective on that and just some closing remarks.
Sure, Matthew, thank you. As I was listening to the First Lady and Dr. Morgan talk, I kind of focused back on partnership, the idea of multiple agencies with different capabilities and different roles working together to help people not just take care of victim survivors or to put people in jail, but to help be preventative, to help make sure that victimization never occurs to begin with. And having spoken to Sergeant Billy from the Navajo Nation Police Department, I was really encouraged, because historically law enforcement has basically been associated with, there's something happens, they get called, you go take care of it. It's very reactive, and people dread us in many ways, and sometimes for good reason. We get in the middle of domestic violence or other things like that. We're separating families. It's not a great role to play all the time. But what I heard when listening to Sergeant Billy, and I'm sure we're going to see, we talked to the commissioner, that they've taken a more proactive approach to law enforcement, a restorative approach to law enforcement, where they are partners with the community to help create a network of support, a network of resources, so the children don't have to fall by the wayside and become victims due to any vulnerabilities that we can actually predict. And we're not going to be there all the time, and no one pretends we can. The Navajo Nation is vast geographically, and you don't have, a vast number of people in law enforcement protecting you, but you have a lot of different types of law enforcement who have different roles. And by coordinating those, which they already are doing, and creating programs to help family as well as youth, work through those issues they may be experiencing, and connecting them with resources both within their communities and near other communities, by treating them as the precious commodities they are, and not something you put handcuffs on and just put in the back of a car and drive them somewhere and let them go and write a part about. I think that is really where the Navajo Nation is really beginning to shine and really establishing some great foundational work to make it work for everyone. Is it going to happen overnight? Like the First Lady said, it doesn't work that way. However, I think with consistency and diligence, with discipline, I think the Navajo Nation is on the right track to keep getting better and better, helping their children become more successful and learning to not just survive, but to thrive.
Amazing. Thank you, Derek. And Dr. Morgan.
My response to First Lady Nez's 3 generations is, why not start now and join what she is leading, she and the Second Lady. And when we started dreaming about Matthew's vision for ensure justice here, we started looking for ways to partner with youth that are that next generation, and looking for ways to be part of the classroom. And I'm really happy that we were able to bring some of our experts from Orange County to share and cross-learn with your experts here. And I'm really excited about addressing the resilience efforts, and I'm so grateful to be part of starting this generation. 3 generations isn't really that long. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can we give it up for Derek, First Lady Derek and Dr. Morgan today? If you're in the room, give us a virtual hand clap if you're online with us. But we just want to say thank you so much just for your insight and teaching us really the foundational aspects of what human trafficking is and how we can start thinking and dreaming and being a part of this conference. So now we're going to transition into our workshops. So if you're using the Sketch app, you'll see that there's 3 different workshops there. We have partnering with youth to address human trafficking with speaker Ruthie Hanchett. We have trauma-informed classrooms with Alicia Zayas. And we have building caretaker bonds for healing and resilience with Dr. Brenda Neveretti. So you have those 3 amazing workshops. Don't worry, they're all going to be recorded, and we'll have them posted later for you to watch all of them. But right now, we really want you to engage with one of the speakers from this conference and hear from one of those things. So hopping back on your Sketch app, we're going to end this session now, and we're going to go on to another Zoom session where you're going to hear from one of our breakout speakers. So thank you for joining us for our first plenary, and we'll see you in a breakout room.